I'm Rebecca, a 28-year-old software engineer from Seattle. What started as a family reunion celebration turned into the moment I discovered my uncle had been systematically embezzling from my late grandmother's trust fund for over 5 years. When my aunt casually mentioned, "We've been managing your inheritance wisely," I smiled because I had already set a trap that would expose everything. If you want to hear how I caught my own family stealing nearly $2 million, drop a like and let me know where you're watching from. This story of deception and calculated justice will keep you on the edge of your seat. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, I was raised primarily by my grandmother, Eleanor, after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. My grandmother was a formidable woman who had built a small fortune through real estate investments in the Seattle area during the tech boom. She owned multiple properties and had a sharp mind for business that never dulled, even in her 80s. Eleanor's house in Capitol Hill was my sanctuary. The Victorian mansion with its turrets and sprawling garden became my world. While other kids had birthday parties at Chuck E. Cheese, I spent mine in my grandmother's library, surrounded by leather-bound books and her stories of building wealth from nothing. My uncle Richard, my father's younger brother, lived in Portland with his wife Catherine and their son Blake. Richard had always been the family disappointment. He had burned through multiple business ventures, each one failing more spectacularly than the last. A failed restaurant, a tech startup that never launched, a consulting firm that existed mostly on paper. Catherine came from old Portland money, but had somehow managed to spend through most of her inheritance by the time she was 30. Blake, their son, was 3 years older than me. Growing up, family gatherings were uncomfortable affairs where Blake would alternate between ignoring me completely and making snide comments about me being the charity case living off grandma's generosity. The irony of his words would become clear years later. My grandmother noticed everything. She saw how Richard would scan her house during visits, mentally cataloging valuables. She observed Catherine's designer wardrobe despite Richard's supposed financial struggles, and she definitely noticed when family heirlooms would occasionally go missing after their visits, though she never confronted them directly. Instead, Eleanor taught me about money, investments, and most importantly, about protecting wealth. By the time I was 15, I understood compound interest, real estate markets, and trust structures better than most adults. She made me her student in everything financial. Rebecca, she told me one evening as we reviewed her portfolio together, money doesn't just buy things, it buys freedom and security, but it also brings out the worst in people, especially family. You need to be smarter than them, always. I excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and computer science. While Blake was barely scraping through a communications degree at Portland State, I earned a full scholarship to the University of Washington, studying computer science with a focus on cybersecurity and financial systems. My grandmother beamed with pride at my graduation, while Richard and Catherine attended but left immediately after the ceremony. After graduation, I landed a position at a major tech company in Seattle, starting at $95,000 annually. Within 2 years, my salary had doubled through promotions and stock options. I was building my own wealth while living modestly in a studio apartment in Fremont. My grandmother approved of my frugality and ambition. When I was 25, my grandmother called me to her house for a serious conversation. She was 87 and had received a concerning health diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. She had perhaps 18 months, her doctors estimated. "I need to arrange my affairs," she said with characteristic pragmatism, "and I need to make sure you're protected after I'm gone." Over the following months, we worked with her attorney to structure her estate. She owned 4 properties in Seattle worth approximately $4.5 million combined, plus investment accounts totaling another $3.2 million, and various other assets. Her estate was substantial, and she was crystal clear about her intentions. "Everything goes to you, Rebecca," she stated firmly during one meeting with her lawyer, Donald Brewster, a man she had trusted for 40 years. Richard will contest this, I'm certain. He's always felt entitled to my money despite never earning a penny of his own. We created an ironclad trust structure. The properties would transfer to a trust with me as the sole beneficiary, managed by Donald and a professional trustee from a reputable firm. The investment accounts would be similarly protected. Everything was documented meticulously. But my grandmother had one additional request that seemed unusual at the time. "I want Richard named as a co-trustee," she said. "Not with any actual control, but with access to information. I want him to see what he's not getting." Donald objected, citing the risk, but Eleanor was insistent. "I know my son. He needs to be involved just enough to feel important, or he'll challenge everything out of pure spite. This way, he thinks he has a role." She passed away on a Tuesday morning in March, peacefully in her sleep at the hospital with me holding her hand. I was 26 years old, and suddenly the beneficiary of an estate worth nearly $8 million. The funeral was a surreal affair. Richard and Catherine wore black designer outfits that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Blake showed up in a wrinkled suit, clearly hungover, checking his phone throughout the service. They performed grief convincingly for the other attendees, but I saw Catherine's eyes calculating, appraising, planning. The will reading occurred 1 week later in Donald's downtown Seattle office. The conference room overlooked Elliott Bay, the gray waters reflecting the overcast sky. Richard arrived with Catherine and his own lawyer, a sharp-looking woman from Portland who immediately began taking notes. Donald read through the formal legal language, but the essence was clear. Everything went to me. The properties, the investments, the personal effects. Richard received a token bequest of $50,000, explicitly stated as his full inheritance with no further claims to the estate. Richard's face turned crimson as Donald read the provisions. "This is outrageous," he sputtered. "My mother was clearly not of sound mind. We'll contest this immediately." "Your mother underwent full cognitive testing 3 months before her death," Donald replied calmly, sliding documents across the table. "She scored perfectly. Additionally, she recorded a video statement explaining her reasoning, which I'm prepared to show if necessary." Catherine placed a hand on Richard's arm, restraining him. "We understand Eleanor had her reasons," she said smoothly, shooting her husband a warning look. "Though we hope Rebecca will remember family loyalty and Richard's role as co-trustee going forward." That phrase, family loyalty, would echo in my mind for years to come. The trust structure was complex by design. While I was the sole beneficiary, the actual assets were managed by the professional trustee, Margaret Chen from First Seattle Trust Company. Donald served as the primary trustee with legal authority, while Richard held a co-trustee position that was largely ceremonial. He could review financial statements and attend meetings, but had no decision-making power. For the first 6 months, things proceeded normally. Margaret managed the properties efficiently, maintaining them and collecting rent. The investment accounts continued to grow. I received monthly reports showing steady returns and professional management. I was busy with my own career, having been promoted to senior engineer with increasing responsibilities and compensation. Between my salary, stock options, and the trust income, I was financially secure beyond anything I had imagined as that 7-year-old orphan moving into my grandmother's house. Richard attended the quarterly trustee meetings, usually arriving late and leaving early. He would ask perfunctory questions about property values and investment returns, taking notes in a leather portfolio. At the time, his interest seemed like an attempt to stay connected to his mother's legacy. The first red flag appeared almost exactly 1 year after my grandmother's death. I was reviewing the trust statements when I noticed a property maintenance expense that seemed high. One of the Capitol Hill properties, a beautiful Craftsman that was my grandmother's favorite investment, showed $47,000 in repairs for water damage. I called Margaret to inquire. "Oh, yes, there was significant water damage from a pipe burst," she explained. Richard actually handled coordinating the repairs since he was visiting Seattle that week. It was very helpful, actually, saved us time on the emergency response. Something about this explanation bothered me. The property was inspected quarterly, and there had been no mention of plumbing issues. I requested copies of the invoices and contractor information. The documents arrived via email, and they looked professional enough. Northwest Property Restoration, based in Seattle, with detailed invoices for emergency water extraction, structural drying, mold remediation, and reconstruction. But when I searched for the company online, I found only a basic website with stock photos and minimal information. No reviews, no business history, no contractor's license number. I called the phone number on the invoice. It rang to a voicemail with a generic greeting. No one ever returned my call. The address listed was for a UPS store mailbox. My cybersecurity training kicked in immediately. I began investigating more thoroughly. The bank account that received the $47,000 payment was registered to Northwest Property Restoration. But when I discreetly contacted a former colleague who now worked in financial fraud investigation, she helped me trace it further. The account had been opened just 2 months before the supposed water damage, and the payments from it went to various personal expenses. Restaurants, retail stores, a payment to a luxury car dealership in Portland. I said nothing to anyone, but continued investigating. Over the next 3 months, I discovered a pattern. Every few months, there would be a significant expense from one of the properties. A roof repair, an electrical upgrade, HVC replacement. The invoices always came from different contractors, but the companies shared similarities. Minimal online presence, recent business registration, and payments that ultimately flowed to personal accounts. In total, over the 18 months since my grandmother's death, approximately $340,000 had been paid to what I now suspected were fraudulent contractors. Money that had ultimately gone to Richard and Catherine. But I needed more evidence, and I needed to understand the full scope of the fraud before confronting anyone. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. "You need to be smarter than them. Always." I took a week of vacation time and dove into a comprehensive investigation. Using skills I had developed in cybersecurity work, I traced financial connections, researched business registrations, and mapped out the fraud network that Richard had created. The scheme was more sophisticated than I initially thought. Richard had created multiple shell companies, each registered in different states. Some were in Washington, some in Oregon, a few in Delaware. Each company had different names: Northwest Property Restoration, Cascade Electrical Services, Emerald City Roofing, Pacific Northwest Construction. The names were generic and forgettable, designed to blend in among legitimate contractors. Each shell company had its own bank account, carefully opened just before being used. The accounts would receive 1 or 2 large payments for supposed property work, then be emptied through ATM withdrawals, transfers to other accounts, or payments to luxury retailers and service providers. The pattern suggested Richard had been planning this from the moment he learned he would be co-trustee. He had leveraged his access to trust information and his ceremonial role to insert himself into property management decisions. Margaret, the professional trustee, was diligent, but she trusted the co-trustee's involvement as legitimate. She had no reason to suspect fraud from a family member in an official fiduciary role. My investigation revealed that approximately $340,000 had been stolen so far, but Richard's system was escalating. The fraudulent invoices were becoming larger and more frequent. At this trajectory, he could steal another $500,000 or more before raising enough suspicion for Margaret or Donald to investigate independently. I spent evenings after work diving deeper, creating detailed spreadsheets documenting every fraudulent transaction, tracing the flow of money, and identifying the ultimate recipients. Richard and Catherine had spent the stolen funds on a new BMW, luxury vacations to Hawaii and Cabo San Lucas, Blake's credit card debts, and home renovations to their Portland house. What struck me most was the audacity. They were stealing from a trust created by Richard's own mother, specifically designed to provide for her granddaughter after she had raised me through childhood and adolescence. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was personal and profoundly cruel. I arranged a meeting with Donald Brewster without mentioning my discoveries. I wanted his legal perspective on the trust structure and his opinion on hypothetical fraud scenarios before revealing what I had found. Hypothetically, I asked during our meeting in his office, if a co-trustee were to commit fraud against the trust, what would be the legal remedies? Donald, who had been a lawyer for 45 years, immediately understood this wasn't a hypothetical question. Rebecca, what have you found? I laid out everything. The spreadsheets, the traced transactions, the shell companies, the pattern of escalating theft. Donald's expression transformed from professional composure to controlled outrage as he reviewed the documents. This is embezzlement, he stated flatly. Clear-cut criminal fraud. Richard has violated his fiduciary duty in the most egregious way possible. He could face 5 to 10 years in prison if convicted, plus full restitution and civil penalties. What are my options? I asked. We can report this to the police immediately, Donald replied. With this evidence, they would likely arrest him within days. We would also remove him as co-trustee immediately and pursue civil recovery of all stolen funds plus damages. What about confronting him first? I asked. Giving him a chance to return the money before involving authorities? Donald shook his head firmly. I advise against it. He's clearly escalating, and confronting him could lead to him hiding assets or attempting to cover his tracks more thoroughly. Plus, there's no guarantee he would comply. But I wasn't satisfied with the standard approach. Something about the situation reminded me of my grandmother's strategic thinking. She had always approached problems with layers of planning, thinking several moves ahead like a chess player. What if we set a trap? I suggested. Something that would not only document his theft, but would demonstrate intent and ongoing fraud so clearly that there could be no possible defense. Donald leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. What did you have in mind? Over the following weeks, we crafted a plan that was elegant in its simplicity. We would create an opportunity for Richard to commit one more act of fraud, but this time, every element would be controlled, documented, and unquestionably criminal. The bait would be a major property renovation. One of the trust properties, a large Victorian in Capitol Hill similar to my grandmother's home, needed genuine updates. The kitchen was outdated, the bathrooms needed modernization, and some structural work was legitimately required. We would approve a real renovation project with a budget of $250,000. But here was the trap. We would let Richard know about the project and give him the opportunity to recommend contractors. Based on his pattern, we knew he would insert one of his shell companies into the bidding process. This time, however, we would be watching everything. Margaret, the professional trustee, was brought into the plan. Initially hesitant about the deception involved, she ultimately agreed when Donald explained the importance of building an ironclad case. If we confront him now with what we have, a clever lawyer might create just enough doubt, Donald explained. But if we catch him in the act, with contemporaneous documentation, there's no defense possible. We planted the seeds carefully. During the next quarterly trustee meeting, Margaret mentioned the upcoming renovation project. The Capitol Hill Victorian needs significant work. She said, distributing a preliminary assessment. We're looking at approximately $250,000 for kitchen, bathrooms, and some structural repairs. I'll be soliciting bids from contractors over the next month. Richard's eyes lit up momentarily before he controlled his expression. I actually know some excellent contractors in the Seattle area, he offered. From my restaurant days, I'd be happy to reach out to them for bids. That would be helpful, Margaret replied smoothly. Any recommendations you have would be appreciated. The trap was set. Now we waited to see if Richard would take the bait. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard moved exactly as predicted. He created a new shell company, calling it Heritage Home Restoration LLC, registered in Delaware. The company's website appeared professional, featuring before and after photos stolen from legitimate contractors' portfolios. He even created fake reviews on Google using purchased accounts. Richard submitted a bid through Heritage Home Restoration for $245,000, carefully coming in just under budget to appear competitive. The bid was detailed and professional, clearly copied from legitimate contractor proposals he had found online. But we had set up additional surveillance. Margaret had informed Richard that due to the project's size, she would require an in-person walkthrough with any serious bidding contractors. Richard was forced to hire an actual contractor to conduct the walkthrough while posing as the representative of Heritage Home Restoration. The contractor he hired, a man named Tom Williams, had no idea he was being used for fraud. Tom conducted the walkthrough professionally, providing legitimate feedback on the scope of work. Meanwhile, we recorded everything: the meetings, the conversations, and most importantly, Richard's coordination with Tom, where he explicitly coached him to provide estimates matching the fraudulent bid. We also traced Heritage Home Restoration's bank account, watching as it was opened and prepared to receive funds. Everything was documented with timestamps and digital records that would be admissible in court. 3 weeks after the initial trustee meeting, Margaret called a special meeting to award the renovation contract. Richard attended in person, unable to mask his anticipation. Donald was there, as was I, and 2 people Richard didn't recognize: Detective Sarah Morrison from the Seattle Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, and FBI Special Agent Kevin Park, who handled wire fraud cases involving interstate commerce. Before we proceed with awarding the contract, Donald began, his voice formal, we need to address some irregularities that have been discovered in the trust's financial records over the past 18 months. Richard's face, which had been expectant moments before, suddenly drained of color. What irregularities? He asked, but his voice wavered. Perhaps we should start with Northwest Property Restoration, I said, speaking for the first time. I placed a binder on the table, sliding it toward Richard. The company that supposedly repaired water damage at the Capitol Hill Craftsman property, except there was no water damage, was there, Uncle Richard? He opened the binder, his hands trembling slightly as he saw the documented evidence. Financial trails, corporate registrations, traced bank transactions, all laid out with meticulous clarity. Or Cascade Electrical Services, Donald continued, placing another binder. Or Emerald City Roofing, or Pacific Northwest Construction. Shall I continue? We have documents for all 8 shell companies you've created over the past 18 months. I don't know what you're talking about, Richard attempted, but the words came out unconvincingly. These were legitimate contractors recommended to me. If there was fraud, I was deceived as well. Were you also deceived when you opened the bank accounts for these companies? I asked. Or when you withdrew the funds? We have security footage from 3 different banks, showing you conducting transactions for these supposedly independent contractors. Richard's lawyer, the sharp woman from Portland who had attended the will reading, looked at her client with barely concealed disgust. She had clearly known nothing about this. And then there's Heritage Home Restoration, Margaret added, placing the final thickest binder on the table. The company you created just 3 weeks ago, specifically to bid on this renovation project. The company whose bid we're gathered here to discuss. That's different, Richard said desperately. Heritage Home is a legitimate company. Run by Tom Williams? I asked. The contractor you hired to pose as the company representative? We spoke with Tom yesterday. He was quite cooperative once he understood he had been used as an unwitting participant in fraud. He's provided a full statement. Detective Morrison stood, placing a formal document on the table. Richard Patterson, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and theft from a trust estate. You have the right to remain silent. The formal reading of rights seemed to happen in slow motion. Richard sat frozen as the detective's words washed over him. His lawyer immediately began damage control, speaking quietly but firmly about not saying anything. Catherine, who had been called to the meeting under the pretense of discussing family matters, sat in shock in the adjacent waiting area. When she saw her husband being led out in handcuffs, her facade of sophistication crumbled into something desperate and calculating. "He was trying to protect our family," she said, approaching me with tears that I suspected were more strategic than genuine. "Blake has expenses, and we've had financial difficulties. Richard just wanted to take care of us." "By stealing from a trust his mother created for me," I replied coldly. "Money she earned through decades of hard work, specifically designated to protect me the way she protected me after my parents died. And you thought that was acceptable?" The FBI agent stepped forward, addressing Catherine. "Mrs. Patterson, we'll need you to come to our office to answer some questions about your involvement. We've traced several of the stolen funds to your personal accounts and expenditures." Her tears stopped instantly. "I want a lawyer," she said, her voice hardening. As they left, I felt an odd mixture of emotions. Satisfaction at the successful trap, certainly, but also sadness at the confirmation of everything I had suspected about my uncle's character. And underneath it all, gratitude to my grandmother for teaching me to be vigilant and strategic. Donald placed a hand on my shoulder. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said quietly, "not just of catching them, but of how methodically you built the case." The legal proceedings that followed were lengthy, but ultimately conclusive. Richard was charged with 9 counts of embezzlement, multiple counts of fraud, and wire fraud for the interstate nature of his shell companies. Catherine faced charges as an accessory, though prosecutors offered her a plea deal in exchange for testimony against Richard. Blake, surprisingly, had no legal involvement. The money stolen had funded his lifestyle, but there was no evidence he knew the source was criminal. He simply thought his parents had more money than they actually did. When he learned the truth, he called me once, a brief, uncomfortable conversation where he mumbled something about not knowing and being sorry. I never heard from him again. The trial attracted significant local media attention. Family member embezzles $340,000 from trust created by own mother was a headline that generated considerable coverage. Richard's lawyers attempted various defenses, suggesting confusion about his role, claiming the trust structure was ambiguous about his authority, even briefly attempting to argue that as the son, he had a moral right to the money, regardless of legal designation. None of these arguments succeeded. The evidence was overwhelming, and the final trap with Heritage Home Restoration demonstrated clear, ongoing criminal intent. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Richard was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution of $340,000 plus interest, along with additional fines and penalties. Catherine received 2 years of probation and a suspended sentence contingent on her cooperation and payment of her share of restitution. The financial recovery was complicated. Richard and Catherine had spent much of the stolen money, leaving them with insufficient assets to provide full restitution. Their Portland house was sold, the BMW repossessed, and their bank accounts seized. Even with all these measures, they could only immediately repay about $180,000. The remaining balance would be collected through wage garnishment once Richard was released from prison, a process that would take years. Donald filed liens ensuring the debt would follow them indefinitely. Throughout the legal proceedings, Richard maintained that he had been justified, that his mother had treated him unfairly, that he deserved a larger share of her estate. His resentment was evident in every court appearance, his expression alternating between defiance and self-pity. "Your grandmother saw this in him," Donald told me after the sentencing. "That's why she structured the trust the way she did, with all the protections and documentation requirements. She knew he would try something." Eleanor had been right about so much. She had protected me not just with her money, but with her wisdom and foresight. The trust structure she created, while giving Richard just enough involvement to prevent a spite-based legal challenge, also created the documentation trail that exposed his fraud. After the trial concluded, I made significant changes to my life. I moved from my studio apartment into my grandmother's Capitol Hill house, the Victorian mansion that had been my childhood sanctuary. The trust transferred it to my direct ownership, and I spent 6 months renovating it with legitimate contractors, transforming it into both a residence and a home office. I also transitioned in my career, leaving my position at the tech company to start my own cybersecurity consulting firm specializing in financial fraud detection. My experience with Richard's embezzlement had revealed patterns and techniques that were surprisingly common in trust and estate fraud. I developed software tools to help trustees and estate administrators detect early warning signs of similar schemes. The business grew rapidly. My first clients were other trustees from First Seattle Trust Company, referred by Margaret. Within a year, I had 15 employees and contracts with multiple financial institutions across the Pacific Northwest. The irony wasn't lost on me that my uncle's betrayal had essentially funded a new career path. I also established the Eleanor Patterson Foundation for Financial Literacy, named after my grandmother. The foundation provided free education on trust structures, estate planning, and fraud prevention, particularly targeting elderly individuals and young beneficiaries who might be vulnerable to exploitation. We offered workshops, published guides, and even created an online course that reached thousands of people. Through this work, I heard countless stories similar to mine. Family members exploiting trust positions, beneficiaries discovering years of theft, and the devastating personal toll of financial betrayal by those who should be most trustworthy. Every story reinforced my commitment to the Foundation's mission. One particular case involved a woman named Jennifer, whose brother had stolen nearly $500,000 from their father's estate while serving as executor. She attended one of our workshops 2 years after my uncle's conviction, and I spent hours helping her understand the legal options and evidence-gathering techniques she would need. "How did you get through it?" she asked me during a coffee meeting. The anger, the betrayal, knowing your own family would do this? I considered the question carefully. Honestly, I channeled it into something constructive. Every time I felt angry, I worked on the investigation, or the business, or the foundation. My grandmother always said money reveals character. Richard revealed his, and that freed me from any obligation to maintain a relationship built on illusion. Jennifer eventually pursued charges against her brother, using techniques she had learned from our foundation. Her case succeeded, resulting in criminal conviction and full restitution. 3 years after Richard's conviction, I received an unexpected letter. Prison mail, from my uncle. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won out. The letter was surprisingly brief. No apology, no acceptance of responsibility, just a simple statement. "I hope you're satisfied with destroying your family. Your grandmother would be ashamed of what you've become." I read it twice, then filed it away in a folder with all the other documentation from the case. The accusation that my grandmother would be ashamed was particularly absurd. She had literally designed the trust structure to catch exactly this type of fraud. She had taught me to be vigilant, strategic, and uncompromising when it came to protecting myself financially. I wrote back, equally briefly. Grandmother taught me that family built on exploitation isn't family worth preserving. She also taught me that accountability isn't destruction, it's necessity. The person she would be ashamed of is the one who stole from a trust created by his own mother. I hope prison gives you time to consider that. I never received another letter. My relationship with the Patterson family side-effectively ended with Richard's conviction. Catherine moved to Arizona after her probation ended, working as a retail manager and sending monthly restitution payments of $200, a pittance that would decades to clear her debt. Blake disappeared from social media and public life, presumably embarrassed by his parents' criminal behavior. I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, but I also felt no guilt. They had made choices, calculated and deliberate, to steal money that wasn't theirs. The consequences were appropriate and necessary. Meanwhile, my chosen family grew stronger. My colleagues at the consulting firm became close friends. The foundation connected me with dozens of people who shared similar experiences, creating a community of support and advocacy. I developed a relationship with James, a fellow cybersecurity professional I met at a conference, who understood the complicated dynamics of family financial betrayal because his own father had embezzled from his business partner. On what would have been my grandmother's 90th birthday, I held a private memorial at her grave. Just me, some fresh flowers, and a bottle of her favorite wine. I told her about the business, the foundation, the house restoration. I told her about catching Richard and seeing justice served. "You prepared me for all of this," I said quietly, pouring a small amount of wine onto the grass beside her headstone. "Not just with money, but with wisdom. You saw what was coming, and you armed me with everything I needed to protect myself." A year later, the foundation published a comprehensive guide on trust fraud prevention, drawing on dozens of cases, including my own. The guide detailed common schemes, warning signs, and protective measures that trustees and beneficiaries should implement. It became a standard resource for estate attorneys across the country. Now, at 28, I live in financial security with a successful business and meaningful work that helps others avoid what I experienced. The trust my grandmother created continues to generate income through well-managed properties and investments. I've grown that foundation she built, adding to it through my own success. The most valuable inheritance wasn't the money, though. It was the lessons about vigilance, strategic thinking, and the importance of protecting what you've built. It was the understanding that family is defined by behavior, not just biology. And it was the knowledge that justice, when pursued with patience and precision, can be both satisfying and healing. Richard will be released from prison in 3 more years. I've thought occasionally about what that moment will mean, whether he'll attempt contact, whether there will be any acknowledgement or apology. I don't expect either. Some people remain convinced of their own righteousness, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. But I'm prepared for whatever comes next. My grandmother taught me that much. The boundaries I've established are firm and well defended, both legally and personally. The wealth I've built, both inherited and earned, is protected through sophisticated structures that would make Eleanor proud. Looking back on that initial discovery of the fraudulent water damage expense, I realize it was the beginning of a journey that fundamentally changed my understanding of family, trust, and justice. The investigation taught me skills I now use professionally. The legal battle demonstrated the importance of meticulous documentation, and the aftermath showed me that it's possible to emerge from betrayal stronger, wiser, and more purposeful. I often think about the moment when the detective arrested Richard in that conference room, his expression of shock and indignation as if he were the victim rather than the perpetrator. That cognitive dissonance, that inability to see his own actions clearly, was perhaps the saddest part of the entire situation. But I also think about the hundreds of people who have attended our foundation workshops, who have read our guides, who have successfully protected themselves or recovered stolen assets because of what I learned through this experience. Every success story feels like validation, not just of my efforts, but of my grandmother's vision in preparing me for the reality of financial relationships. The trust fund that Richard tried to steal has nearly doubled in value under Margaret's continued professional management. The properties have appreciated with Seattle's real estate market. The investment accounts have been reallocated to capture growth in technology and sustainable industries. Everything Eleanor built continues to grow, protected now by multiple layers of oversight and security. I've established my own estate plan, learning from both my grandmother's wisdom and Richard's betrayal. When I eventually have children, they'll inherit not just financial security, but the knowledge of how to protect it. They'll understand that money is a tool, not an identity, and that family relationships must be earned through trust and respect, not assumed through biology. The foundation recently launched a scholarship program for young people pursuing degrees in finance, law, or cybersecurity who have been affected by family financial exploitation. The first recipient was a brilliant 18-year-old woman whose stepfather had stolen her college fund. She's now studying computer science at the University of Washington, the same path I took. I want to help people like you help me, she told me at the scholarship ceremony. I want to make sure other people don't become victims. That's when I truly understood the full scope of what my grandmother had created. Not just a trust fund or an estate plan, but a legacy of empowerment and protection that extends beyond our family to help countless others. 3 years after the trial, Donald Brewster retired, turning 75 and deciding it was finally time to step away from active practice. At his retirement party, he pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Your grandmother once told me that you would surprise everyone," he said, his eyes warm with memory. "She said you had her mind for strategy and her strength of will. I didn't fully understand what she meant until I watched you handle the Richard situation." "She taught me everything important," I replied simply. "She did more than that," Donald corrected. "She recognized who you were and gave you the tools to become fully yourself. That's the greatest gift a grandparent can give." As I drive through Capitol Hill now, passing the properties my grandmother acquired decades ago, I see them differently than I once did. They're not just investments or income sources. They're monuments to a woman who built security from nothing, who protected what she created with intelligence and foresight, and who passed that legacy to someone who would honor and protect it. The Victorian mansion where I now live is filled with her furniture, her books, and photographs spanning her 90 years. Every room holds memories of lessons learned, conversations shared, and wisdom imparted. When I work late in her library, surrounded by the same leather-bound books that fascinated me as a child, I often feel her presence, as if she's looking over my shoulder, approving of how I've navigated the challenges she anticipated. Uncle Richard made a choice to betray his mother's trust and his niece's security. He chose greed over integrity, manipulation over honesty. And in doing so, he revealed exactly why my grandmother structured her estate the way she did. She saw his character clearly and protected me from it, even from beyond the grave. The satisfaction isn't in his punishment, though justice was necessary and appropriate. The satisfaction is in the life I've built, the people I've helped, and the knowledge that my grandmother's legacy continues not just through money, but through the values and wisdom she instilled in me. So to anyone who has discovered betrayal by family members, who has faced exploitation by those who should protect you, or who struggles with the aftermath of financial manipulation, I offer this. Your worth isn't defined by their actions. Your future isn't limited by their betrayal. And justice, pursued with patience and precision, but can transform trauma into purpose. My grandmother's final gift wasn't the trust fund. It was the understanding that I was strong enough, smart enough, and strategic enough to protect it and myself from anyone who might try to take it. In teaching me to set a trap for Richard, she taught me the most important lesson of all, that the best defense against exploitation is knowledge, preparation, and the courage to act when necessary. Richard is still in prison. Catherine is still making her small restitution payments, and I'm living a life built on the foundation my grandmother created, enhanced by the lessons learned from defending it. Every time I sign a contract for the consulting firm, every time someone attends a foundation workshop, every time I walk through the halls of my grandmother's house, I'm reminded that the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's the strength to protect yourself, the wisdom to see clearly, and the courage to act when those closest to you prove they can't be trusted. The consulting firm continued to expand in ways I never anticipated. Within 3 years of launching, we had offices in Portland, San Francisco, and Denver. Our client base grew from individual trustees to major financial institutions, law firms specializing in estate law, and even government agencies investigating complex financial fraud cases. The techniques I had developed to catch Richard became the foundation for a sophisticated fraud detection software platform that we licensed to banks and trust companies across the country. One of our most significant breakthroughs came when analyzing patterns across hundreds of estate fraud cases. We discovered that approximately 63% of trust and estate fraud involves family members in fiduciary positions, and that the average fraud goes undetected for 4.7 years before discovery. These statistics became the basis for our early warning system, an algorithm that flags suspicious patterns in trust account activities before significant damage occurs. The software saved one elderly woman's estate from a scheme remarkably similar to Richard's. Her nephew, serving as co-trustee of her $12 million estate, had created shell contracting companies and was systematically billing for fictitious property repairs. Our system flagged the pattern after just 3 fraudulent invoices totaling $89,000. The professional trustee investigated immediately, discovered the scheme, and the nephew was arrested before he could steal more. That woman sent me a handwritten letter thanking me for creating tools that protected her life's work. Stories like hers reinforced why the work mattered. Every fraud we helped prevent, every scheme we helped uncover, felt like honoring my grandmother's memory in the most meaningful way possible. James, the cybersecurity professional I had been dating, proposed to me on the anniversary of my grandmother's death. We were at her gravesite, where I had brought flowers as I did every year. He understood the significance of the location, the weight of what my grandmother had meant to me. She would have approved of this timing, he said as he knelt beside her headstone. She taught you to be strategic about everything, including choosing the right partner. I hope I've proven worthy of that standard. The ring was a vintage sapphire, not a diamond. He knew I valued substance over showiness, meaning over expense. We married 6 months later in a small ceremony at the Victorian mansion, surrounded by chosen family rather than blood relatives. Margaret Chen attended, as did Donald Brewster despite his retirement. Colleagues from the firm, friends from the foundation, and a few clients who had become friends over the years filled the house with genuine celebration. No one from the Patterson side was invited. That bridge had been burned completely, and I felt no regret about it. Blake sent a card, a brief note saying he was happy for me and sorry for everything. I appreciated the gesture, but didn't respond. Some relationships, once broken by fundamental betrayal, can't and shouldn't be repaired. The foundation's work expanded into legislative advocacy. Working with state representatives in Washington and Oregon, we helped draft bills strengthening fiduciary oversight requirements and increasing penalties for trust fraud. The Eleanor Patterson Financial Protection Act passed in Washington state 2 years after Richard's conviction, requiring additional documentation and third-party audits for trusts exceeding $5 million in value. Your grandmother's name is now attached to legislation that will protect thousands of people, Donald told me at the bill signing ceremony. That's a legacy that extends far beyond her personal wealth. The governor who signed the bill invited me to speak at the ceremony. Standing at the podium in the state capitol, I talked about Eleanor's wisdom, Richard's betrayal, and the importance of systemic protections against exploitation. The speech was covered by local media and picked up nationally, leading to speaking invitations from financial conferences, law schools, and advocacy organizations across the country. My visibility in the field brought unexpected consequences. I received numerous letters and emails from people discovering or suspecting financial exploitation by family members. Each story was unique in its details, but familiar in its emotional core. The shock of betrayal, the conflict between family loyalty and self-protection, the question of whether to pursue justice or let it go for the sake of peace. I tried to respond to as many as possible, offering guidance, resources, and sometimes just validation that their feelings of betrayal were justified. One letter particularly moved me. It came from a man in his 50s whose sister had stolen nearly $300,000 from their mother's estate while serving as executor. He had discovered the theft, but was being pressured by other family members to drop the matter rather than tearing the family apart. Everyone keeps telling me that family is more important than money, he wrote. But isn't stealing from our mother a betrayal of family? Why am I the villain for wanting accountability? I called him directly, something I rarely did, but his situation resonated so deeply with my own experience. We talked for over an hour about the false choice between family and justice, about how enabling theft isn't love, about how accountability can actually be the most caring response when someone has lost their moral compass. He pursued charges against his sister. She was convicted, and while the family relationships were indeed damaged, he told me later that he felt lighter having stood up for his mother's wishes and his own principles. The family I lost wasn't worth keeping, he said, echoing thoughts I had often had about the Pattersons. Richard's scheduled release date approached, bringing with it a complex mix of emotions I hadn't fully anticipated. 6 years had passed since his arrest. I had built a successful business, married, established the foundation, and helped countless people avoid or escape situations similar to mine. His imprisonment had been backdrop to all of this achievement, a fact that existed but didn't dominate my thoughts. Now, with his release imminent, I found myself considering what, if anything, his freedom would mean for me. Would he attempt contact? Would he try to rebuild some relationship, however damaged? Would there be threats or attempts at revenge? I discussed these possibilities with James, with my therapist, and with Donald, who remained a trusted advisor despite his retirement. "You've built strong legal and personal boundaries," Donald assured me. "The restraining order we filed as part of the criminal case prohibits him from contacting you directly or coming within 500 feet of your residence or business. If he violates that, he goes back to prison immediately." Still, I took additional precautions. I hired a private security consultant to review and upgrade security systems at both my home and the business. I briefed my employees about the situation without sharing unnecessary details. I informed the foundation's board so they would be prepared for any potential disruption. Richard was released on a Tuesday morning in October. I knew the exact date and time because the victim notification system sent me an alert. He walked out of the federal correctional facility in Sheridan, Oregon at 8:47 a.m., picked up by Catherine, who had waited out his sentence in Arizona, but apparently was still committed to their relationship. For a week, nothing happened. No attempts at contact, no violations of the restraining order, no drama. Life continued normally. I began to relax, thinking perhaps Richard would simply move on with his life, focusing on rebuilding rather than seeking any kind of confrontation or reconciliation. Then, on the 8th day after his release, I received a letter. Not from Richard directly, but from a lawyer representing him. The letter was carefully worded to avoid violating the restraining order while still conveying Richard's message. He claimed to have found peace in prison, to have undergone extensive therapy and financial counseling, to have come to terms with his actions and their consequences. The letter expressed that Richard hoped, someday, there might be an opportunity for reconciliation. Not now, he acknowledged, but perhaps in the future when more time had passed and more healing had occurred. He wanted me to know he was working to become a better person and to eventually make amends, not just legally through restitution payments, but personally through changed behavior. The letter concluded by saying Richard understood if reconciliation was never possible, but that he wanted to leave the door open should I ever feel differently. There was no pressure, no request for response, no timeline or expectation. I read the letter 3 times, searching for manipulation, hidden agendas, or passive aggression. The tone seemed genuine, but years of analyzing financial fraud had taught me that sincerity can be performed, that words on paper don't necessarily reflect internal reality. James found me in my office that evening, the letter still in my hand. "What are you thinking?" he asked gently. "I'm thinking that I don't know if he's sincere or if this is another manipulation," I admitted. "I'm thinking that 6 years ago I would have wanted an apology and acknowledgement. But now, I realize I don't actually need either. I've moved on whether he's changed or not." "So what will you do?" James asked. "Nothing," I replied, placing the letter in a file folder. Not responding is a response. If he's genuinely changed, he'll respect my boundaries and continue building his own life. If he hasn't, then any engagement would just create new problems. Either way, my life moves forward without him in it. That decision brought unexpected peace. For years, I had imagined various confrontations, apologies, or acknowledgments that might provide closure. I had thought justice meant seeing Richard punished and hearing him admit wrongdoing. But true closure, I realized, wasn't about him at all. It was about reaching a place where his actions, his prison sentence, his release, and even his potential remorse simply didn't factor into my emotional equilibrium. The foundation reached a significant milestone shortly after Richard's release. We helped pass similar legislation in Oregon, California, and Colorado, creating a Western regional framework for enhanced trust oversight and fiduciary accountability. Law schools began teaching cases based on my situation, using Richard's fraud as an example of both criminal methodology and effective detection techniques. One law professor from Stanford invited me to be a guest lecturer in his trusts and estates course. Standing in front of 70 future attorneys, I walked them through the case step by step, explaining not just the legal aspects, but the emotional complexity of pursuing justice against family. The hardest part wasn't gathering evidence or testifying at trial, I told the class. It was accepting that my uncle, my father's brother, saw me not as family, but as a resource to be exploited. That realization changes how you view every relationship, making you question whether people value you for yourself or for what you can provide. A student raised her hand. Do you regret pursuing charges? Would it have been easier to just walk away? I considered the question carefully. Easier in the short term, absolutely. But easier doesn't mean better. If I had walked away, Richard would have continued stealing until the trust was depleted. Other potential victims, whether family or others he might have targeted professionally, would have had no warning. And I would have spent the rest of my life knowing I enabled theft from my grandmother's legacy rather than protecting it. So you don't believe in family forgiveness? Another student asked. I believe in accountability, I corrected. Forgiveness doesn't require enabling continued harm or pretending betrayal didn't occur. You can forgive someone and still maintain boundaries that protect yourself. The two aren't mutually exclusive. These conversations with students, with workshop attendees, with people reaching out through the foundation, helped crystallize my own understanding of what the experience had taught me. Financial betrayal by family isn't just about money. It's about values, respect, and the fundamental question of whether relationships are built on genuine care or selfish exploitation. My consulting firm took on an interesting case that brought these lessons into sharp focus. A Silicon Valley executive, a woman named Patricia, who had built a successful tech startup, discovered that her brother had been systematically stealing from her company. As CFO, he had access to accounts and had created fictitious vendor relationships similar to Richard's contractor scheme. Over 3 years, he had embezzled nearly $2 million. Patricia contacted us after reading about my story in a business magazine. I don't know if I can do this, she told me during our initial consultation. He's my brother. We grew up together. Our mother will be devastated if I press charges. I heard echoes of the pressure that man had faced from his family when his sister stole from their mother's estate. The same false equivalency between enabling crime and preserving family. Let me ask you something, I said to Patricia. If your brother had stolen $2 million from a stranger's company, would your mother want him to face consequences? Of course, Patricia replied. She taught us better than that. So why is stealing from you, his sister, somehow more acceptable? Why does family status make the crime less serious rather than more? That question shifted Patricia's perspective. She realized that by treating family theft as less serious than stranger theft, she was actually devaluing the family relationship. If anything, betraying family trust should carry additional moral weight, not less. Patricia pursued criminal charges. Her brother was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison. Their mother was indeed upset, but ultimately came to understand that accountability was necessary. The company recovered most of the stolen funds through asset seizure and restitution requirements. 2 years later, Patricia joined the foundation's board of directors. You gave me permission to protect what I built, she told me at her first board meeting. Not just financially, but emotionally. I stopped feeling guilty for expecting basic honesty from family members. Her presence on the board, along with several other successful professionals who had experienced similar betrayals, strengthened our advocacy work. We weren't just speaking from one person's experience anymore. We represented a growing community of people who had faced financial exploitation by family and chose accountability over enabling. The foundation launched a hotline providing immediate support and guidance for people discovering or suspecting family financial fraud. Staffed by counselors trained in both financial matters and family dynamics, the hotline received hundreds of calls in its first year. Many callers just needed validation that their suspicions weren't paranoid, that their feelings of betrayal were justified, that protecting themselves didn't make them bad family members. One call particularly stayed with me. An elderly man, 86 years old, called to report that his daughter was stealing from his accounts. He had noticed unexplained withdrawals and transfers, but felt ashamed to report his own child. She's all I have left, he said, his voice breaking. My wife passed. My son lives overseas. If I report her, I'll be completely alone. The counselor who took the call, a woman named Maria who had exceptional emotional intelligence along with her financial expertise, spent over an hour with him. She helped him understand that being alone was better than being exploited, that genuine family relationships don't include theft, that his daughter's actions had already damaged the relationship, even if he chose not to acknowledge it. You deserve to be treated with respect, Maria told him. Your daughter has stolen your money, but you don't have to let her steal your dignity too. He filed a police report. The daughter was arrested, and the funds were recovered. But what struck me about his story was what happened afterward. The daughter's arrest prompted his son overseas to reach out, having been estranged from the family for years, specifically because of the daughter's manipulative behavior. Father and son reconciled, and the son moved back to the United States to be closer to his father. Exposing one toxic relationship made space for a healthy one to rebuild, Maria explained when debriefing the case with our team. That happens more often than people realize. The family members worth keeping usually support you when you stand up to the ones who aren't. This pattern emerged repeatedly in the cases we handled. When someone took a stand against family financial exploitation, they often discovered which relationships were genuine and which were based on enabling or benefiting from the exploitation. It was painful, but ultimately clarifying. James and I decided to start a family, a decision that brought new perspective on inheritance, trust, and family dynamics. When I became pregnant with our daughter, I found myself thinking about Eleanor's relationship with me, about how she had used her resources not just to provide comfort, but to teach principles and build strength. I want to raise her the way Eleanor raised me, I told James one evening as we prepared the nursery. Not with unlimited resources or indulgence, but with education about money, strategy, and self-protection. We'll teach her that love and exploitation can't coexist, James added. That family is defined by behavior, not blood. That boundaries aren't walls, they're foundations. Our daughter, Eleanor James Patterson Chen, taking both our last names, was born on a spring morning after 12 hours of labor. Holding her for the first time, I felt the weight of responsibility my grandmother must have felt when I came to live with her after my parents' death. The responsibility not just to provide resources, but to shape character and judgment. During maternity leave, I had time to reflect on the trajectory of the past decade. From discovering Richard's theft to building a consulting empire, to advocating for legislative change, to starting my own family, the journey had been complex and transformative. The betrayal that could have broken me had instead become the foundation for purpose and meaning. I wrote a letter to my daughter to be given to her when she turned 18. In it, I detailed the story of her great-grandmother Eleanor, of Uncle Richard's betrayal, of the choices I made and why I made them. I wanted her to understand her family history, including its darkness, so she would be prepared for the reality that not everyone who claims to care about you actually does. Your great-grandmother taught me that love without boundaries is exploitation waiting to happen, I wrote. Real love includes accountability, respect, and the expectation of honesty. Anyone who asks you to sacrifice your well-being for their comfort isn't acting from love, regardless of their words or biological relationship to you. The letter felt important, like passing down not just information but wisdom earned through painful experience. If Eleanor could face similar challenges someday, I wanted her armed with knowledge and perspective that would help her navigate them with strength and clarity. Richard never attempted contact again after that single letter from his attorney. According to the restitution tracking system, he made his monthly payments faithfully, working at a financial services call center in Oregon. Catherine apparently reconciled with him completely, and they lived quietly in a small house in Salem. Blake remained out of contact, his social media presence minimal, and his life largely invisible to me. Their absence from my life felt right, like a wound that had fully healed, leaving only a scar as reminder and evidence. I didn't hate them, didn't wish them ill, but also had no desire for any form of relationship. They had shown me who they were, and I had responded appropriately. That chapter was closed. The consulting firm reached the 10-year anniversary milestone with a major celebration. Over 200 employees across 6 offices, hundreds of clients, millions of dollars in fraud prevented or recovered. We had built something extraordinary from the ashes of betrayal, transforming personal trauma into professional expertise that protected countless others. At the anniversary gala, I gave a speech reflecting on the journey. 10 years ago, I discovered my uncle was stealing from my inheritance, I began. That discovery could have been just a painful family scandal, handled privately and forgotten. Instead, it became the foundation for this company, for legislative change, for a movement toward greater accountability in family financial relationships. I paused, looking around the room at employees, board members, and friends. What I learned from that experience is that how we respond to betrayal defines us more than the betrayal itself. We can become bitter and withdrawn, or we can transform pain into purpose. We can hide exploitation to preserve the illusion of family harmony, or we can demand accountability and build genuine relationships with people who demonstrate integrity. The speech received a standing ovation, but what mattered most wasn't the applause. It was the conversations afterward, with people sharing their own stories of family financial betrayal and how they had found strength to address it. Each story confirmed that speaking openly about these experiences helps others recognize and respond to their own situations. The foundation published a memoir I had written, detailing the full story of Eleanor's life, Richard's theft, and the aftermath. The book became a bestseller in the personal finance category, not because people were interested in my specific situation, but because the themes resonated universally. Financial exploitation by family members is far more common than most people realize, and victims often feel isolated and uncertain about how to respond. Book tour events became de facto support groups, with audience members sharing their own experiences during Q&A sessions. A woman in Chicago whose father had stolen her inheritance. A man in Atlanta whose sister had embezzled from their family business. A young woman in Miami whose stepmother had systematically depleted her late father's estate before she turned 18 and could challenge it. Each person's story was unique, but the emotional core remained consistent. The shock of betrayal, the conflict between family loyalty and self-protection, the journey toward accountability and boundaries. Hearing these stories reinforced that the work we were doing through the foundation and the consulting firm addressed a genuine and widespread need. On what would have been Eleanor's 100th birthday, I organized a major foundation event in Seattle. We brought together legislators who had championed financial protection laws, attorneys specializing in trust and estate fraud, social workers who helped exploitation victims, and dozens of people whose lives had been changed by the foundation's work. The keynote speaker was a federal judge who had presided over numerous family financial fraud cases. Eleanor Patterson's story and her granddaughter Rebecca's response to betrayal represents a fundamental shift in how we think about family financial relationships, she said. For too long, we've operated under the assumption that family members deserve unconditional trust simply because of blood relationship. Cases like this remind us that trust must be earned through behavior, not assumed through biology. After the event, I visited Eleanor's grave alone. Standing beside her headstone as the sun set over Capitol Hill, I told her about everything she had missed. About Richard's imprisonment and release, about the business and the foundation bearing her name, about her great-granddaughter who carried her name and would learn her wisdom, about the hundreds of people protected by laws inspired by her foresight in structuring the trust to catch fraud. You prepared me for all of this, I said quietly, touching the cool marble of her headstone. Not just with money, but with wisdom about money. You taught me that financial security isn't just about accumulating wealth. It's about protecting it from those who feel entitled to it. You taught me that family relationships must be built on mutual respect and honesty, not exploitation disguised as obligation. A gentle breeze rustled the trees surrounding the cemetery, and for a moment, I could almost feel her presence. Her approval, her satisfaction that the lessons she taught had been learned and passed forward to protect others. Walking back to my car as twilight descended, I reflected on the complete arc of the journey, from 7-year-old orphan to successful professional, from trusting family member to vigilant protector of assets and boundaries, from victim of attempted theft to advocate for systemic change. The transformation hadn't been easy or painless, but it had been necessary and ultimately rewarding. Richard's betrayal had revealed truth I might have otherwise remained blind to until much greater damage had been done. In attempting to steal my inheritance, he had actually given me the clarity and motivation to protect not just my own interests, but those of countless others facing similar exploitation. His worst impulses had inadvertently created positive change extending far beyond our family. That irony wasn't lost on me. The man who tried to take everything had actually given me the foundation for building something meaningful and lasting. His greed had funded my purpose. His betrayal had taught me lessons I now shared with others. His punishment had demonstrated that accountability for family financial exploitation was possible and necessary. As I drove home through the Seattle evening, past the properties Eleanor had acquired and I now managed, past the office building where my consulting firm occupied 3 floors, past the community center where the foundation held workshops, I felt profound gratitude. Not for the betrayal itself, but for the strength and wisdom to respond to it constructively. Eleanor had given me wealth, but more importantly, she had given me the tools to protect and use that wealth wisely. She had taught me to see clearly, think strategically, and act decisively when necessary. Those lessons had proven more valuable than any amount of money, and they were lessons I would pass to my daughter and through the foundation to others facing similar challenges. The greatest inheritance isn't financial resources. It's the wisdom to protect what you build, the courage to demand accountability from those who betray you, and the strength to transform pain into purpose. Eleanor understood that, and she made sure I understood it too. Now, years after her death and years after exposing Richard's theft, I finally fully appreciated the completeness of her gift. She hadn't just left me money. She had armed me for battle against exploitation, taught me to recognize manipulation, and given me the foundation to build a life of genuine security and meaningful purpose. Richard is still making his restitution payments. Catherine is still living with the consequences of enabling his theft. Blake is still dealing with the shame of having parents convicted of criminal fraud. And I'm still building on the foundation Eleanor created, enhanced by the lessons learned from defending it against those who tried to steal it. Every day, through the consulting firm and foundation, I help people protect themselves from financial exploitation by family members. Every day, I teach them the lessons Eleanor taught me about money, trust, and the necessity of boundaries. Every day, I honor her memory, not just by managing the wealth she left, but by sharing the wisdom that made that wealth meaningful. Have you ever discovered that family members were exploiting you financially? How did you handle the situation, and what boundaries did you establish afterward? Share your experiences in the comments, and if this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe. Remember, protecting yourself from exploitation isn't selfishness, it's self-preservation, and sometimes the people who should protect you most are the ones you need protection from. The real victory wasn't catching Richard or recovering the money. It was breaking the cycle of exploitation, building something meaningful from the experience, and ensuring that my grandmother's legacy of strength and strategic thinking continues to protect and empower others long after both of us are gone. Thank you for reading my story. And remember what my grandmother always said: money doesn't just reveal character, it demands that you protect yours, to see clearly, and the courage to act when those closest to you prove they can't be trusted. Have you ever discovered that family members were exploiting you financially? How did you handle the situation? And what boundaries did you establish afterward? Share your experiences in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe. Remember, protecting yourself from exploitation isn't selfishness, it's self-preservation. And sometimes the people who should protect you most are the ones you need protection from. The real victory wasn't catching Richard or recovering the money. It was breaking the cycle of exploitation, building something meaningful from the experience, and ensuring that my grandmother's legacy of strength and strategic thinking continues to protect and empower others long after both of us are gone. Thank you for reading my story, and remember what my grandmother always said: money doesn't just reveal character, it demands that you protect yours.